Welcome to The Budding Writer. This podcast offers an outlet for aspiring authors to showcase their original short stories or fan fiction one-shots. I'm your narrator, Shayna Armand. This is how it works. When you hear this sound, the story will begin, and when you hear it again, the story has ended. Today's episode is going to give us the unique privilege of reading a fan fiction from the world of Game of Thrones. Now, if you haven't watched the show or you haven't read the books, don't worry. This is a prequel story that pertains to it, and there will be no spoilers. Now, our writer is Priestess of Groove, and she's available on the fanfiction website archiveofourown.org. And we will only be reading the first 3 chapters, so if you'd like to continue with the story, it'll be available on that website for you. Sit back and enjoy. The Lion's Fall by Priestess of Groove, narrated by Shayna Armand. Chapter 1. Behind the closed door of the Lord Commander's room, Sir Barristan sighed in frustration as he labored over the piece of parchment. Who would have thought commanding the greatest knights in the realm would be like having to corral a bunch of finicky children? He thought sourly. Sir Meryn Trent had begged off his shift for the evening due to illness, which Sir Barristan suspected was actually a hangover. A real knight would power through something so small, but he had no evidence to indicate otherwise, and he'd rather not assign a sick knight to guard the king. A king's guard had to be on his toes at all times, and ill people tended to have the focus of a sleeping hound. Sir Ayres Oakheart was currently guarding the king. He was reliable, if strangely timid. He tried to avoid doubling shifts, though. Sir Mandon Moore had spent the entirety of the night before guarding the queen. He was a possibility for substituting, but he too had a reputation along with Sir Boris Blount of begging off shifts. Sir Boris was currently guarding the Queen, so he was out. Sir Preston Greenfield was away, visiting family, and wasn't due back for another week. The children, Marcella and Juliana, were being guarded by the Queen's personal guard. Not for the first time, he was grateful that Sandor Clegane was the sworn shield of Prince Joffrey, so that he didn't have to worry about scheduling to guard for him. He settled his quill tip on Jaime Lannister's name and paused. It was Sir Jaime's free day. As much as he didn't like Sir Jaime, he was by far the most reliable member of the King's Guard he had. Ever since he asked for 3 months to tour the Westerlands with his brother, he had never asked for another day. That had been 4 years ago. If Barristan didn't know better, he'd say that Boros and Mandon had a tendency to walk all over Jaime, pressing him into taking their shifts. Jaime was never a pushover, as was obvious in the training yard, when he sent them sprawling like they were no better than boys. However, he always obliged and took their shifts, never complaining, never protesting, just quiet and immovable, not unlike a stone golem. In fact, something had been bothering Barristan about Sir Jaime for some time. He was too quiet, too docile, too compliant. Those were the last words Barristan would have said about Jaime of old, even back during the reign of King Aerys, when the circumstances were on a downward swing. He had attempted fake cheer, papered over with sarcasm. No one was happy then, least of all a green boy who was being used as a tool by King Aerys. They had all suffered then, Jaime more so than the rest of the King's Guard, having to be so close to King Aerys at all times. Regardless, Sir Barristan still hadn't forgiven Jaime for murdering their king. He knew it had been a mistake to leave a green boy like him alone, to look after the king by himself. However, he was ordered to follow his prince, so follow he did, never raising an objection. He now wished he had, on more than one occasion. Perhaps things wouldn't have gone so sour if he had been brave enough to talk to his prince about his thoughts and concerns. What is done, Barristan thought. He took pride in keeping his thoughts about his brothers and the King's Guard to himself. But when he had learned what Jaime had done, he marched over, wounded and all, to lecture him. Sir Jamie had affected smug arrogance, and had taken the lecture from Sir Barristan without even so much as a contrite expression. If it was at all possible, his callousness infuriated Barristan even more, and just as he was leaving, he sneered, "I knew you were too young for the King's Guard." Jamie's smile faltered for the first time. It was only then he saw the disarming smile for what it was, a facade. But Barristan had been too enraged back then to care, and stormed away from the young King's Guard. It had been over 10 years, and they still barely said more than a handful of words to one another. Barristan attempted to cover his own dislike of Sir Jamie by simply ignoring him in all situations that didn't require interaction. Sir Jamie let him. However, as he was forced to live in close proximity with his brothers-in-arms, he couldn't help but notice that Jamie had no friends or acquaintances. He knew King's Landing was a difficult place to live, and he wasn't oblivious to the backstabbing that was rife throughout the keep. But even he had a few lords he would rub elbows with and, when he had time off, play dice. The last time Barristan saw Jamie truly smile was when his brother Tyrion had visited, and that was a few years ago. Furthermore, Sir Jamie only ever seemed to be known by the name of Kingslayer. The king in particular was fond of calling him that, and Barristan had noticed a slight tightening in Jamie's eyes when he said it. But otherwise he said nothing, nor did anything. Another oddity about Jamie was his peculiar fondness for wearing the King's Guard helmet. It was required to be worn out on the battlefield, but in the keep at a time of relative peace, Barristan had made it optional. None of the other brothers wore it, only Jamie. In fact, Barristan remembered with some amusement that he'd scared the wits out of a prostitute exiting the king's room because she thought he was just a propped-up suit of armor. She screamed when the suit of armor suddenly looked her way. Any attempts to talk with him were rebuffed. Barristan had quickly learned not to ask beyond a yes-no question, and even then he frequently received a nod or a shake of his head in reply. He's not even sure Jamie had ever spoken a word to Sir Preston Greenfield, and he had been added to the roster 10 years ago. If Jamie didn't want to talk, he couldn't make him. The other King's Guard soon drove Jamie from Barristan's mind, complaining about scheduling and challenging him for fights in the training ring. He only ever made a cursory check on Jamie when he was present. The only time he seemed to come alive was when he was in a sword fight. Whether he was on the battlefield or in the training yard or in a tourney, he still delighted in winning against all comers and gloating about it. Even his words were sharp enough to cut, and no one was spared his tongue. That included Barristan. He fought anyone who was brave enough to ask for a bout, and threw them in the dirt. Then, as if to make matches more interesting, he started training with his left hand. This delighted many, as they could finally hold against him. But just as he had a preternatural talent with his right hand, it did not take him long to start winning using his left. It seemed no matter how hard Barristan fought against Jamie, he could never quite win, and the Kingslayer never let him forget that. "Well, I'd better ask if he can cover some Erin Trant's shift tonight." He headed to Jamie's room and quickly rapped his fist on it. When he heard nothing, he said, "Sir Jamie?" "It's Sir Barristan. May I enter?" When he still couldn't hear anything, he tried the knob to find it unlocked and surprisingly empty. Even in the beautiful weather, Jamie had a tendency to spend his off days tucked away in his room. But nothing was out of place. He was just closing the door when he paused. Jamie's sword was leaning against the simple writing desk in the room. Jamie never goes anywhere without his sword, Barristan thought. That sword was as much a part of Jamie as his hand was. He never went anywhere without it strapped to his side, and as King's Guard he was allowed to wear his sword at all times. He closed the door and hurried downstairs. Only Mandan was seated at the table, eating a late breakfast. "Sir Mandan, have you seen Jamie?" "Yeah, the cook." He glanced up to see Barristan glaring at him and said, "He just passed by a few minutes ago. Had a rope in his hands." "A rope?" Barristan felt his heart jolt, then settle. An eerie feeling was stealing over him, even as he tried to quash it.
Did he say where he was going? Has he ever said anything to anyone?
Mandan replied in a curt voice, clearly irritable from his lack of sleep. Thank you, Barristan said hastily and hurried out the door. He glanced around and found Jamie to be nowhere in sight. He just started heading over to the training grounds when he saw a servant out sweeping the stone steps.
Have you seen Sir Jamie Lannister?
The servant was little more than a boy, and he squeaked at being addressed by the Lord Commander. He went stiff as a board and as white as milk. He opened his mouth to say something, but words failed him, and he merely pointed to a hallway.
Thank you,
Barristan replied and strode through the door, frowning. What is Jamie up to?
Where could he be going?
There were few places in the keep that offered solitude, let alone privacy. He was pretty certain that Lord Varys himself would say there's no such thing as privacy in these walls. He had a feeling that was why Jamie had a tendency to stay in his room whenever he wasn't guarding or training. A thrill of fear shivered through his body, and he glanced around, wondering where it had come from. Hurry! The thought appeared in his head as if planted there, and his stride quickened. Before he realized it, he was at the God's Wood. He blinked in befuddlement, but at the same time, of course, no one comes to the God's Wood. There are no worshippers of the old gods here. He stepped into the forest and began winding his way through the trees and bushes, when he caught sight of the weirwood tree. He came to a halt. Jamie had climbed the tree and was now perched on the thickest branch.
What is he doing?
He was wearing a simple pair of breeches and a woolen shirt. His face seemed even more blank than usual. Not that he saw his face often, since it was usually covered by a helmet. He surveyed the area and then quite suddenly locked eyes with Barristan. His face darkened for a moment as they regarded each other. Then he shoved off the branch.
No!
Chapter 2. Barristan only just saw the noose tied around Jamie's neck the moment he shoved off the branch. He ran through the trees. His feet felt like bricks weighing him down, and it seemed to take a lifetime to reach the bottom of the hot tree. Jamie was kicking and choking in the air, spittle flew from his mouth, and the trapped blood turned his skin red as if sunburned. But his hands were steadfastly planted at his side, not even attempting to claw away the rope holding him.
If I can get high enough, I can cut down the rope, he thought,
and started climbing, mentally berating himself for wearing his full armor. He was barely more than halfway up when he heard a crack like thunder, and an orange light caused him to turn. His eyes widened as a fire flared up and ate through the rope. In the next instant, Jamie fell lifeless to the ground. Barristan jumped to the ground and scrambled over to him, frantically pushing him over.
Jamie! Jamie, be alive!
He pulled the noose away, and almost instantly Jamie began coughing and sucking in air. Jamie cracked his eyes open.
Gods, no.
He rasped, closed his eyes again, and fell unconscious.
What did you think you were doing?
Barristan shouted at him, knowing perfectly well that his words fell on deaf ears. He kept his hand on Jamie's chest, taking comfort in the way it rose and fell.
I'll go get help.
But he hesitated. He didn't like the thought of leaving Jamie alone. Not that there was anything in these woods that would kill him. Out of the corner of his eye he saw the noose again, and reached for it. He hadn't undone the loop, merely loosened it to get it over Jamie's head, and he examined the end of it. The rope was charred from where it had burned through.
How?
Barristan knew what he saw. The rope had spontaneously come alight with flame, and burned only long enough and fast enough to free Jamie before fizzling out. He glanced over at the heart tree.
Did the old gods spare you? But to what end?
He had long thought that Jamie would suffer in the deepest of the 7 levels of hell for his crimes against the crown when he murdered King Ares II, but it seemed that they had made a rather overt attempt at saving him. Barristan shivered.
Don't do anything foolish. I'll be back shortly,
Barristan replied, knowing full well Jamie would not have heard the instructions. He rushed back to the White Sword Tower and was breathing heavily when it came into sight. He shoved through the door and looked around. Sir Mandan Moore was nowhere to be seen, likely gone to bed. Barristan began stripping himself of his armor and dumping it noisily onto the shared table. He was not about to run upstairs and back to the Godswood wearing that again. He took the stairs two at a time, and before long was banging on Mandan's door. He could hear a human voice speaking inaudible curses at the sound of feet crossing the floor.
"Yes, Lord Commander?"
Mandan said, cracking the door open. He was only ever formal when he was furious.
"Come with me. It's urgent."
He glared at Barristan.
"Why?" "Just come. That's an order," Barristan growled. "Put boots on. You'll need them."
He started back down the stairs and stacked his armor neatly on the table while he waited. When Mandan finally entered the kitchen, his face was that of a disgruntled bear, and his footsteps were as heavy as one. His expression softened when he saw Barristan's armor piled up in the kitchen. "What?"
"Follow me."
Barristan didn't bother hiding pretenses. The moment he stepped out the door, he began running over to the Godswood. Servants and nobility alike stared as he pelted through the hallways. Only after they entered the Godswood, away from prying eyes, Mandan shouted,
"What's happened? Why are we doing this?"
Barristan didn't even bother answering him. The next moment they found themselves breathing heavily over Jaime Lannister. The blood had the time to drain from his face, and his skin was now pale and sickly. A deep blue bruise was already forming around his neck.
"Sir Jaime tried to kill himself," Sir Barristan said. "He what? What the hell does he have to kill himself over?"
"I don't know," Barristan replied, and there was a growl in his voice. "I only just arrived in time to stop it. Help me bring him back to his room. I've got his torso." Sir Mandan led the way, backing up from the Godswood. If they drew attention before, there was practically a corridor of servants, lords, and ladies awaiting them. Out of the corner of his eye, Barristan saw a pair of maids' eyes grow wide as they abandoned their chores to race deeper into the keep, no doubt to inform the Queen about the state of her brother. "What happened to him? Is he all right?" Questions flew at him with the swiftness of starlings. He ignored them all and continued to the White Tower. When they reached it, they switched positions so that Barristan was going up backwards. He had to let one hand go briefly to get the door, but they managed to finally lie him on his bed without dropping him.
"Sir Mandan, wake Sir Meryn and tell him to see me. Then go retrieve the Grand Maester. Make sure he's on his way." "Yes, Lord Commander,"
Mandan said with a quick nod and departed. Sir Jaime had the second highest room in the tower due to seniority, so all other knights had rooms beneath his. Barristan took the wooden chair at the desk and sat next to Jaime's bed and stared at him in helpless confusion. The last time he was in a similar position with Jaime, it had been just after King Robert had married Queen Cersei. Jaime had started having violent nightmares and would scream loud enough to wake the whole tower. Barristan had been puzzled and asked for an explanation, but Jaime refused to provide one. Once, when he was going to speak to the king, he had passed Jaime, standing guard, and had noticed his eyes seem far away. He stopped to get a closer look and could swear he saw primal fear. He called Jaime's name then, and his eyes immediately turned to his. "Yes, Lord Commander?" he had asked in a banal voice.
"I was ensuring you were alert."
"I know my duty," he snapped. The nightmares had eventually faded away, but Barristan wasn't entirely convinced they were gone. However, with the addition of more Kingsguard who were more fervent about their demands, Jaime's troubles had faded into the background of his mind. "This is my damn fault," Barristan thought, shaking his head unhappily. "Some Lord Commander I am." There was a knock at the door.
"Come in," Sir Barristan barked.
Sir Meryn Trant stepped in groggily, looking pale.
"You asked for me, sir?"
"Yes. You will be guarding the king tonight, as was originally scheduled," Barristan replied. Sir Meryn's eyes grew comically wide as his mouth gaped like a fish.
"You are dismissed."
Sir Meryn scowled, but nodded and left. Barristan only turned again when he heard a muffled, "Your Grace." outside the corridor. In the next instant the queen barged in, her golden hair fanned out behind her as she strode over to him. Her expression was just as fierce and aggressive as her walk. She was alone, so perhaps Sir Boros had the presence of mind to stay outside. Sir Barristan stood and bowed. "Your Grace," he said. "What has happened to my brother?" she demanded. He glanced at Jamie. He knew that he would probably prefer this remain private, but he had forced his hand when he caught him trying to kill himself. "Need I remind you that the penalty for lying to your queen is death?" Cersei said, her voice like a blacksmith's hammer, striking an anvil. "Threats won't be necessary, Your Grace. There's really no way for me to put this, but your brother tried to hang himself." She actually stepped back, blinking in shock as if Sir Barristan's very words had struck her. Finally she gathered her composure again and said, "You lie." "I do not, Your Grace. I saw him do it." "Why didn't you stop him?" "I hadn't realized at the time what he was doing, Your Grace. You have my sincerest apologies." "That's not good enough. I will strip you of your title and you will be exiled from the city. My brother always deserved to be Lord Commander over you," she snapped. Hardly, Sir Barristan thought, but he stayed quiet. Only the king could strip him of his rank, and even despite his failures, he rather doubted the king would do that. He was a highly celebrated knight of the realm, and there would likely be backlash, especially if Sir Jaime, the Kingslayer, were promoted in his place. That would mean even more of the most powerful positions in King's Landing would be controlled by the Lannisters, he thought, and ice seemed to fill his veins at the thought. He would never openly disrespect the queen, but he did not like her and was suspicious of the moves the Lannister family made. Jaime, at least, seemed to respect his place as a Kingsguard and had never once been asked to be removed. Cersei swept around him and took the seat he initially had at her brother's side and grabbed Jaime's hand in both of her own. "Jaime," she whispered, "why would you do such a thing? We are never to be apart. How could you?" Barristan frowned and started to back away. He didn't want to intrude on a private moment between the queen and her brother, but he didn't like the idea of leaving Jaime alone with her. While a good portion of his quiet disposition snuck by Barristan, it had been easy to see that Jaime loathed his sister. There had been talk all through the kingdom about how close the Lannister twins were with one another, suspicious gossip even, but they must have had a falling out somewhere along the way, because Jaime could barely manage to disguise his hate. The only scheduled adjustment he had asked for was to be assigned to his sister less frequently. Not even Robert's tauntings could outweigh whatever his sister said or did to him. He opted to wait just inside the door. The queen seemed to have banished him from her mind as she lovingly stroked his fingers and whispered what he could only presume were soothing words. After a while, Sir Barristan heard the clanking of a chain, and opened the door just as Grand Maester Pycelle reached the landing. "Lord Commander? Your Grace, I came as swiftly as I could," he wheezed, shuffling over to the bed. "Grand Maester Pycelle, make sure that he is in perfect health. Sir Barristan claims he tried to hang himself," the queen said, looking at Barristan with cold eyes. "I know he would never do such a thing." "It seems you don't know your brother very well at all, Your Grace. For that matter, I don't know him either," Barristan thought, though he tried to remain impassive. The queen stood behind Pycelle, wringing her hands, and Sir Barristan remained by the door. The maester fussed and mumbled under his breath as he examined the developing bruises around Jaime's neck. He checked his eyes and pulled up his shirt to examine the rest of him. At some point, Pycelle glanced furtively at him by the door. Then he stood up and announced, "It is my determination that someone appears to have attempted to strangle Sir Jaime." "Grand Maester, I was there. Sir Jaime tried to hang himself. It was I who cut him down and saved his life," Sir Barristan retorted, shocking himself with the way the lie easily rolled from his tongue. But certainly no one would believe that the rope had spontaneously burst into flame. Pycelle shifted in embarrassment, glancing between him and the queen. Circe continued to glare at him with suspicion. She opened her mouth to speak when they heard heavy footsteps outside, and then King Robert barged in.
I was informed the Kingslayer had been injured. What happened? Robert demanded,
but it was a bored tone. Robert, my love, Sir Barristan failed in his duty as Lord Commander to oversee the King's Guard. My brother, my twin, is near dead due to his failure.
The king looked at her for a moment and then barked a laugh. Ha ha! And how did he fail the infamous Kingslayer? Unless I'm mistaken, your twin is a man grown, and the best sword in the 7 kingdoms.
The queen's anger was growing cold as she clenched her fists, but she seemed unable to speak. Barristan spoke up.
Your Grace, Sir Jaime tried to hang himself. I found him in time and saved him.
Robert's face darkened.
The Kingslayer tried to hang himself? Any idea why?
He has been unconscious since I removed the rope. Where did he try to hang himself? Circe asked, returning her fury to him.
In the Godswood.
What tree?
Sir Barristan hesitated. On the heart tree, my lady.
Circe turned to Robert. I would ask you to uproot the hot tree.
You could just as easily use another tree, woman. What would you have me do? Raise the entire Godswood? No, I won't do that.
My brother has been injured.
And he did it to himself. If you want to do something about it, then figure out why he did it. It's pretty damn clear, though, that this is nothing I need to concern myself with.
Robert turned to walk away. Then I want you to remove Sir Barristan from his post as Lord Commander, Circe yelled as the last effort.
Robert laughed again. Ha! For what reason, Circe? He saved your brother's life. You should be thanking him.
Jaime would never commit suicide. We are twins, bound together for life. He must have injured him.
Robert's expression darkened further. Sir Barristan is the most celebrated knight of the realm. I would sooner believe his word over your forked-tongued wife.
With that he left.
Your Grace, Sir Barristan said quietly as he exited.
Through the entire exchange he had stood there by the door with his head down, feeling more like a child stuck in the middle of his parents' argument. Circe fumed and turned away, marching back to Jaime, who continued to remain unconscious. Pycelle was standing awkwardly by the chair he'd been sitting in to examine Jaime.
Will he recover? She asked. Yes, Your Grace, he will survive. His voice may be permanently damaged, but I have a potion in my stores that should ease the pain in his throat when he wakes. He should also eat only soup until his throat heals.
Fine. Bring it to me and I will ensure he takes it, Circe said, once more taking the seat and Jaime's hand. The Grand Maester shuffled past him out the door. As soon as he was gone, Circe said, What are you still doing here, Lord Commander?
Sir Jaime is my charge, Your Grace. It is my responsibility to ensure he gets the treatment he needs.
He is my brother. I will treat him. Now leave.
Your Grace,
Sir Barristan said for the last time and reluctantly left. He didn't even acknowledge Sir Boros Blount as he went downstairs. He would need a strong cup of tea as he puzzled over this. After he sent away a servant, he sat at the table and prayed. Please give me the wisdom to help Jaime. I promise I will not fail him this time. Once he had his tea, he went back upstairs to tackle the schedule. He was going to make sure Jaime had the time he needed to recover, and he was determined to find the cause. Chapter 3.
Lord Tywin Lannister, Lord Paramount of the Westerlands. I'm writing to inform you that your son, Sir Jaime Lannister of the King's Guard, tried to hang himself earlier today. I was able to intervene in time. Grand Maester Pycelle says that his voice may suffer permanent damage, but he is otherwise healthy and whole. All time and consideration will be given to him for proper healing before he returns to his duties. Lord Commander Barristan Selmy.
Sir Barristan leaned back and sighed, glancing out the window to see a waning sunlight. He probably should have written that letter first, but he had been dreading it all day. He'd give it to Pycelle himself in the morning. Lord Tywin would be in a fury once he received it, and he wouldn't be surprised at all if it was enough to rouse the Lord to ride to King's Landing and demand his son be released from his duties. He'd been angling to get his heir back for years. He hadn't seen Sir Jaime since he left the Queen by his bedside. Not even the Queen could stay in the White Sword Tower past nightfall, so he had to make sure she was gone. Sir Boris Blount was still standing at the door, and he nodded at Sir Barristan. He entered the room and stopped in his tracks. Queen Cersei had her brother by his hair, with his head pulled back in a most painful way. His hands were clenching the bed with a death grip, and he was trying to pull his head away, and his feet dug into the bed as he struggled to get out of her reach without touching her. "You are mine, do you understand that? We are meant to be together, two halves of one whole. But you push and push. Be careful that I don't take more drastic measures to return you to me." With that, she attacked his lips in what he supposed was meant to be a kiss, but Jaime finally pushed her away, sliding himself as far back into the corner of his bed as he could. She leapt to her feet. "Why, you—" "Your Grace, it is sunset. I suggest you return to your quarters." Sir Barristan spoke up. His voice was measured, but he was tense with anger and his jaw was clenched. She stared at him in shock, and she seemed to shiver with terror under his gaze. She quickly made her exit, and Sir Boros Blount followed her. The knight had not seen the proceedings, as he had been faithfully turned away from the door. It was probably for the best. Even after Cersei had left, Jaime continued to remain huddled in the corner of his bed, though Barristan had a feeling it was less out of fear and more out of a desire to hide. He trembled no more, but his gaze was deliberately turned toward the wall, and his mouth drawn into a stubborn line. Sir Barristan shut the door and took the once again empty chair by the bed. "How are you feeling?" he asked softly. "Fine." Jaime rasped and winced at the pain in his throat, still refusing to look at him. "Don't lie to me," Barristan growled, causing Jaime to actually turn to him. "You tried to kill yourself. I was there, if you haven't forgotten." Jaime sneered at him. "Don't act like you care now," he whispered, and once again winced at the pain. "Why'd you even bother saving me?" "I didn't." Jaime gave him a piercing look. "I didn't reach you in time. I was climbing the tree, getting closer to cutting you down, when the rope caught fire and burned through. It was unlike anything I'd ever seen. You were saved by the gods," Sir Barristan said. His voice had started out in a low rumble and ended in a whisper, while Jaime's expression appeared not to change. He saw a light of recognition in his eyes. "You know why." "No, I don't. I don't know what you're talking about. You're mad." Jaime snarled at him, but the words stumbled out of his mouth as though said in a panic. A lump had formed in Sir Barristan's throat, and for the first time in his long life he felt true fear. He'd always felt so calm and self-assured, even in battle. But now he had a king's guard who tried to kill himself, and the gods had deliberately and plainly intervened to prevent that. He wasn't sure which made him more apprehensive, that the gods revealed their existence in this way, or that it was Jaime Lannister they had saved. "Don't hide from this, Sir Jaime. What do the gods want with you? Is it the Seven? Is it the old gods?" Jaime only continued to sneer at him, and remained silent, his eyes full of anger and distrust. Barristan sighed. "Look, I know we haven't seen eye to eye since King Aerys died. I admit I disliked you and distrusted you to some degree ever since. You have upheld your oath since then, however. You are a part of the King's Guard,
and as such it is my duty and responsibility to help you." He chuckled in his raspy voice, which quickly turned into a cough, and he gave Sir Barristan a bitter smile. "It's your responsibility. It's your duty. You don't care. I'm not explaining anything to you or anyone. You can go now. I promise I won't try to kill myself anymore." With that, Jamie flattened out on his bed and put his back to him. Barristan winced. "I could have explained that better," he thought, and rubbed the back of his neck. He really did want to help Jamie. Suicide was not something to be taken lightly. Clearly something had gone wrong, and he needed to get to the bottom of it. It was important the King's Guard not only look strong, but be strong, and a failing member would weaken the kingdom's faith in the institution. But he also had to approach Jamie on a more personal level. He had not taken the dissociation of being treated like a knight well. He began glancing around the room as though he could find the solution, but his eyes found the potion Grand Maester Pycelle had left to treat Jamie's throat. He picked it up and said, "The Grand Maester left you this mixture to ease your throat. I imagine he'll bring you your doses every day. He also said you are to eat only soup until your throat heals. Please rest, Jamie." He started towards the door and glanced over one last time. Jamie continued to face the wall. "You will not be allowed to resume your duties until you tell me what ails you." Barristan didn't wait for a response and simply headed upstairs. He needed to put in a good night's rest so that he could guard the king the following day. Hopefully my ultimatum didn't incense him. Jamie was as stubborn as the best of them. It was going to be a long wait. The next morning, Sir Barristan had taken his letter to Grand Maester Pycelle at the very edge of dawn. The Grand Maester was short-tempered for having been woken so early in the day, but he only grumbled under his breath about it. He had encouraged him to leave, but Sir Barristan refused until he saw the raven fly himself. Now Sir Barristan stood inside the king's chambers, sweating in his armour, and it had nothing to do with the summer heat. He was about to lie to his king. Granted, it was a lie of omission, but he had never, consciously, made a decision to defy his king. For all that he felt he was above the scheming in the Red Keep, he'd now have to engage in it. If he told Robert that Cersei had forcefully kissed her brother, Jamie's life would be forfeit. The king's anger was like a flood, and anyone caught in the area would drown in it. He would never believe that Cersei could get away with kissing a knight that didn't want to be kissed. If the whole point of this was to find a way to heal Jamie, he would first have to safeguard his life in more ways than one. He could give up Jamie. Were he fresh from the hurt of losing Prince Rhaegar and discovering Jamie had slain the king, he would have. It was his opinion that Jamie had forever tainted the honor of the King's Guard with the blood of the king on his hands. He still couldn't believe King Robert had allowed him to retain his position. And yet, despite all the chances he had to kill King Robert, especially since he was insulting the Queen with every whore and serving girl he slept with, Jamie had yet to even raise his voice at him. He had been steadfast and faithful all of this time. Or would the gods intervene once more? He would not deny it was tempting to reveal the truth and see how the gods would react, but a strong compulsion told him that was not a good idea. Something must have caused Jamie to snap, though. Yet his first action was to take violence against himself, not anyone else. Why? Barristan thought. It was that question circling through his head that was the reason why he was betraying his king. "Is something on your mind, Selmy?" The king spoke up, bringing Barristan back to the present. Robert barked a laugh and said, "Ha! I caught you daydreaming. You are human after all." "I don't daydream, your grace," Sir Barristan replied automatically. Robert gave him a disbelieving look. For once, the king was doing his own work.
They were merely papers that needed the king's seal of approval. The Lord Hand, John Aaron, had already done the difficult task of actually reading them to know what Robert was signing, and had approved them. It was the only task that Lord Aaron refused to allow Robert to duck out on.
Your Grace, I must bring to your attention an issue that has arisen regarding Sir Jaime Lannister.
Robert sighed.
He's already tried to hang himself this week. What has he done now?
Actually, Your Grace, it's not about what he's done, but what was done to him, Sir Barristan replied. He had to choose his next words very carefully. I entered the room yesterday evening as the sun was setting to find the Queen abusing her brother. The king's head came up, and he narrowed his eyes.
Abusing him? This is the Kingslayer we're talking about. He'd never let anyone lay a finger on them and live.
And this is the Queen, his sister. For all that Sir Jaime has irrevocably stained his honour, there has never been a rumour of him raising his hand to a lady. Putting aside that she is his sister, he would be put to death for any aggressive moves towards the Queen, Sir Barristan replied in a voice with a sharp edge.
What did you see her do to him?
She grabbed him by his hair and slapped him when he resisted. He thought his voice wavered slightly with the lie. Could Robert see the sweat streaming off him? Robert's face grew thunderous.
Cersei does have a reputation for abusing the servants.
There's no reason to believe she wouldn't abuse the King's Guard, who are under her powers as well, Sir Barristan said. He thought perhaps that was enough to get Robert to agree, but the fat king shook his great bearded head.
She's still very partial to her own family. Why would she hurt her brother?
Why would Sir Jaime feel the need to kill himself? Robert grew quiet.
Did she say she was the cause?
He refuses to speak on the matter. He will not resume his duties until he is ready to return to them. Robert still seemed unable to make a decision, so Barristan pushed harder.
If you recall,
Queen Cersei accused me of having strangled her brother. She is, at the minimum, abusing her authority over the King's Guard. Robert's face grew red, and his voice was a growl at his order.
Send for her now.
Yes, Your Grace, Barristan replied, trying to swallow the stone that seemed to be lodged in his throat. He summoned a servant and sent them scurrying to find Queen Cersei. The young woman did not try to hide the abject terror on her face as she walked away. I'm sorry, Barristan thought, but he returned to his position at Robert's side. A few minutes later, Cersei entered. She strode forward with all the confidence of her status, but her gaze lingered on Sir Barristan. She seemed to be assessing him, and he hoped that his face remained inscrutable. You called for me, Robert? She asked.
Sir Barristan informs me that he caught you abusing your brother.
Robert growled at her. She remained quiet, her eyes still flickering over to him.
Speak!
The king barked. He was being ridiculous. He refused the medicine that Maester Pycelle brought him for his throat.
So you grabbed his hair and slapped him?
She opened her mouth to say something, but seemed to think better of it and cast her eyes down.
Damn it, Cersei. The King's Guard are not the help. You can't just abuse them at your whim. You don't even have the command over them. And what is this I hear about you accusing Sir Barristan of harming your brother?
Colour blossomed in her cheeks, and she pursed her lips. Jaime would never try to deliberately die. He must have been attacked.
Sir Barristan says he was there, that he himself cut down your brother from his own noose.
How can you be so sure?
Sir Barristan has never had cause to lie to me, and I can't see why he would start now. Robert growled. You are banned from entering the White Sword Tower.
She drew herself up in her fury. What about my brother? My twin? He needs me.
If he wants to see you, then he'll damn well pull himself out of bed and visit you. That's enough from you. Out of my sight.
Cersei glared furiously at Barristan as she turned to leave. He closed his eyes and sighed deeply. No doubt he had just created a lifelong enemy in her, but his sigh was partly one in relief. He would have to keep an eye out for any covert means of her influence entering the tower, but Jamie could defend himself against anyone else. Once again, if you're interested in reading the rest of The Lion's Fall, it's available on archiveofourown.org underneath the user priestess_of_groove. Now, she has several other stories. I'm sure you'll be delighted in her writing. A personal confession here. I actually had never read the Game of Thrones books. They'd been recommended to me, but I never did get around to it. Having said that, that is actually an extremely embarrassing confession because I consider myself a bit of a bibliophile or someone who loves to read. So in order to narrate the story, I actually acclimated myself by starting to watch a couple of episodes of the Game of Thrones series that's on HBO. And I thought, oh, well, I'll just get through one or two and I'll be fine. And 5 days and 8 seasons later, I can definitely say I'm a fan, and I fully intend to read the books now because I've always found that the writing is always better than what TV can produce. After all, the imagination doesn't have a production budget or rewrites. I want to give also all of you fanfic lovers a heads up. There's going to be a new podcast out by one of my associates called Fanfic Maverick, where they talk about everything fan fiction. Thank you for being with us today, and I hope you will join us every Friday for new stories from new writers. If you're a writer yourself and would be interested in having one of your stories read on our podcast, please go to our website, www.thebuddingwriterpodcast.com, and check out our specifications. My name is Shayna Armin, and this was The Budding Writer. Until next time, I hope all your stories have happy endings.